welcome to the panel, The Consequences of Cash. Today, at the last day of the third edition of the forum, I must say it's a sad day for me because it's my last year as a friend of the forum. I started 3 years ago as an outside advisor for the foundation and the forum. My name is Eric Noël. I'm a Canadian. I'm the Senior Vice President, Global Perspectives at CGI. CGI is one of the world's largest IT technology company based in Montreal. We have operation in 40 countries. It's a company that is mostly specialized in system integration, managed services, and digital transformation. Before that, I was for 25 years at Oxford Analytica, Oxford, England, and in New York. I'm also the founder of the Canada 2030 project, a former advisor to Policy Horizons in Canada. I'm also the promoter of something called the Intergovernmental Panel on the Future of Humanity. It's like IPCC, but for us, futurists, foresight experts, and people who could help the global system with that. I proposed earlier this year that we look not just at invention, but also at investment, because there are a lot of great inventions that never make it to market. And as futurists, we kind of sometimes miss the cue about economic cycles, behaviors of investors, and the sad stories of entrepreneurs who unfortunately go bankrupt. To explore the topic, we have 3 exceptional volunteers who decided to come here, except for Sacha, who lives here. So to my left, we have Judith Aidoo, and she's an entrepreneur herself in media, communication, entertainment. She has her own fund in Ghana. She spent 14 years as well on Wall Street, including with Goldman Sachs and with her own fund. Sacha is with is it Global Partners?
Global Ventures.
Global Ventures. And she's based there, managing about $400 million worth of investment in Middle East and North Africa, but they also invest globally in emerging markets, Latin America and Asia. Before that, she was with Catterton and 2 other funds who my name I forgot right now, but working out of Kenya, Mexico City, and Singapore, now in Dubai. And also Alex, who's with MIT Solve. So he's in charge of the challenges that MIT puts out in calling great entrepreneurs, great innovators, in speeding up and accelerating their invention. He's working on not just the concepts and policy, but also how do we go and speed up innovation, and he has been doing that remarkably out of Boston. Today, if you look at global markets, there has been a crash in VC funding. We went in 2023, there was about $645 billion US a year going into VC funding, mostly to technology, helping entrepreneurs going to market. It is now down to about $340 billion. The crash is significant, not just in developed countries, but also acute in the developing world, minus 45% in emerging markets. Places like Singapore, Philippines, India have been suffering. Here, Dubai is only minus 18% so far in terms of the drop. It is turning around slowly. The last quarter, we can see that investors are back at taking additional risk, not just in AI. AI was the big topic before this session, but unfortunately, defense tech as well. Wars and conflicts are driving a lot of money into defense tech. Some as well in hardware like quantum computing, data centers, etc. Clean tech is kind of floating here and there. It's kind of in pockets, unfortunately. Underinvestment in ag tech, water tech, etc. The circular economy. And you can see exceptional cases of people who do things like for example, brains for robots. It's a new domain where investors are growing. The side effects, of course, has been also not just on entrepreneurs, but on workers. In the United States, we have lost 191,000 jobs in the tech sector last year. This year, probably 110,000 people will get fired. It can be at A23andMe, it can be at Exostar, etc. Series of companies who had great concepts, but unfortunately, circumstances have made, hopefully, a postponement rather than a complete crash. To begin our conversation, I would like our experts to express their views about the role of capital in taking bold innovations to market. What's the role of capital in accelerating capitalization, commercialization, and execution so we can truly see the fruit of years of innovation becoming on our hands, in our house, in our business, in our life? Judith?
Thank you, and it's been an honor to be here among you all. Thinkers, dreamers, doers. Doesn't get any better than this. So first, let me say thank you, and to the organizers. Very, very grateful, Eric. We've been chatting, I think, for over a month or so. But to actually be here in this space is really beautiful. I wish we could spend another day or two together, but we'll take what we can get. So I'm trained, you'll hear an American accent, but I grew up in Africa. My late father was from Ghana. My mother is a Black American from Charleston, South Carolina. They met at university, at Howard University. Has gotten a lot of airtime recently. And I'm mentioning that because I want to highlight the power of education. I went to Ghana when I was 12 and lived there only for 5 years, but it changed my life. Africa is an extraordinary teacher. I think if you want to see the greatest creativity, go to Africa. If you want to see the worst of humanity, go to Africa. It encompasses everything. So it's a wonderful teacher. And one of the things it taught me as an investor is not to be overly sentimental. So I am an emotional person. My heart is in Africa. I hope to die in Africa in due course, not anytime soon. But we have to be very pragmatic to solve some of or really leverage the opportunities and solve some of the challenges that Africa presents. So I just wanted to quickly say, and I don't, how long do we want us to each talk? Maybe a minute or so? 2 or 3?
2 or 3 minutes, yeah.
Okay. So one of the big things about Africa, how many of you've been to Africa? Show of hands. How many people? Good. Thank you. Wonderful. Okay. So you know 1.5 billion people. It will roughly double in 25 years. Riel Miller, some of you saw yesterday, I've known him for about 15. Kewale, about 15 years. So every year, 2-3 years, another 100 million people, something like that, right? It's a lot. And the average age, we're the youngest continent. You all know this, right? 54 countries, 3,000 languages. If the average age, the youngest continent in the world is Africa, 18-year-olds, that's why I love the young people we're speaking this morning. We really do need to listen to them. We need 1,000 of them in this room, not even 2 or 10 or however many there are. 1,000 Africans, people from Asia, in the room thinking alongside us. Critical. So I want to vouch for that. The second thing I want to say is each of us will have a role as investors. Okay, show of hands. How many of you are investing? Have money at risk in anything? Okay, every hand should go up. The stakes are so high. Everybody should be investing. Understanding you'll lose 90% of your investment, maybe more, but there'll be 1 out of 100 that will work, and that'll be enough. Because some of these is just giving people a chance to think more broadly. Africa's a very rich continent, as many of you know. Most gold, most cocoa. I love the gold souk here. But is any gold mined in this country? No. Any cocoa made in this place? No. The things in our phone, coltan, is it any here? No. Got lots of oil and gas. What this place has, which I really appreciate now, is vision and leadership. My God. I mean, can we just pause for a moment and acknowledge visionary, courageous, long-term thinkers of all kinds, of policymakers, rulers, business class? That is exceptional. That's the thing that's missing. Last thing I'll say, when I worked at Goldman, we used to have a saying that, by the way, I joined Goldman in 1987. There are people in this room that weren't born then. How many were not born in 1987? Very good. 1987, Goldman Sachs was a partnership. They were long-term greedy. When it went public, guess what it became? Short-term greedy. The ethos of the company changed tremendously, but that little change, When partners had their own capital at risk, they could take a longer term. They could invest in things. There were people in a room who literally said, we're not going to do that because it's too risky. It would put our reputation at risk, and there's no amount of money that is worth the thing we've been spending 100 and some odd years building. When they go public, we got new humans, new incentives, new desires. And so to make quarterly numbers or to get better bonuses, maybe they will bend rules. The ethos changed with that little thing called going public. The value systems we have are critical. So I'm interested, and please after this I'll stop talking, but I'm interested in meeting visionary leaders who have money or access to money. Doesn't even have to be a lot of money, but visionary long-term thinkers and capital people who are willing to put money at risk to change the arc of history positively for the 1.5 billion more young Africans and Asians and Latin Americans, but we notice don't care about water or boundaries or gaps or personal risk. They'll get in an inner tube, they'll float to Italy, they'll cross whatever wall you have, they'll throw their children over the other side to get to opportunity, and that's not going to change. So what's the plan? What's the strategy? So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Sacha.
Yeah, some of that definitely overlaps with our thesis around investing. So for context, I'm a partner at a firm based out of the UAE called Global Ventures, which invests in Series A companies, pretty vanilla venture, and across the Middle East and Africa. And the core thesis is really that you can build global businesses out of the region, but also that this region, the Middle East and Africa, is going to be the sort of center of global growth in the next 10 years in a very significant way, which sort of driven by some of the factors that you mentioned, the young populations, the sort of growing population, the rapid urbanization, the increasing digital penetration, are all sort of precursors to this very significant change that we're seeing across the region, and we've been here for, more than 6 or 7 years spending time. And I think that when you sort of ask the question, which is what's the role of what you do in sort of backing bold innovation, I think obviously historically the story of venture is very much tied into being the first check-in or the first punt into futuristic innovations, right? I mean, SpaceX, Tesla, all venture-backed companies, even when the idea, the shared economy idea of getting into a stranger's car was just an idea that was a venture-backed business that became Uber, and now I'm curious to know how many people in this room came to the event today driven by somebody they didn't know in a car that wasn't an official taxi, which I think is just a testament to, I guess, where venture is. The region specifically is interesting because I think that investors in this market have a real opportunity to benefit from the sort of lack of existing infrastructure. So I think that a lot of what we're seeing in developed markets is the difficulty in enacting change in terms of whether it's in the healthcare systems, whether it's in mobility systems, because of the legacy infrastructure, right? It's much harder to get someone who's driving a car with an ICE engine to suddenly switch to an EV because of the switching costs, right? On the continent and here, if the younger population's first car is an EV, you have this real opportunity to accelerate this very futuristic change that previously wouldn't have existed or been an option, maybe perhaps in other markets. So I guess that where I see our role is very much as a catalyst by providing the funding, by providing the path to commercialization and then scale for these businesses or sort of futuristic concepts in the region. And I'm happy to share where perhaps futurism and investment sort of face pitfalls or challenges, specifically around perhaps the shorter term requirements of investors versus the sort of longer term, more patient capital that might be needed for some of our most futuristic ideas. But I have to say, actually, speaking to this event, it's been very enlightening for somebody like me who's frequently in environments primarily focused on financial returns and investments to sort of be in a sort of unbridled environment here where people are discussing sort of very long-term ideas and trying to sort of squish the pessimist in me listening to some of the questions, saying that sounds like a great idea. It doesn't sound like it's going to make anyone much money. And that's, I think, the thing that I'm grappling with, and I'm very grateful to have had the chance to sort of expand my horizons on the past few days.
Perfect. Thank you. Alex?
Yeah, so I am at a piece of MIT, big institution, that works to, on one hand, find, fund, support people who are doing good work anywhere around the world. We select about 30 innovators every year, say seed stage, but we're business model agnostic, so we have some people that will never make anyone any money, but they will have high impact. So we look probably across the SDGs, so learning, health, economic prosperity, climate. And a lot of what we're trying to do is then find the people who are building the better futures, find the Africans, the Asians, the Latin Americans, who are using the technologies that are in many cases much more native to them, mobile money and drones and building new things to solve problems for their communities that have benefits to all those different areas that can go beyond those regions. And our job is to go find the best of them, to validate the technology, to think about how we can find ones that can scale, that can go to many more regions, many more people, much more impact. Sometimes that scale involves more institutional growth, sometimes in replication, we can talk about that. In many other cases, our job is to think about how we de-risk them, use a little bit of philanthropic capital to get them through what I've heard termed pilot hell, where they get stuck at the pilot phase, and get them through to a point where they can get more traditional investment, or at least get to an impact or blended capital raise on that path to a more traditional path where they are going to make money. And there's a clear space for that. And there's lower risk because they've got demonstration. They know how to talk to a set of investors who are coming from a different jargon than they live in. I can give some specific examples maybe because that can get very meta. I mean, we have teams that are building high quality, low carbon homes in Tanzania or Nepal. We have teams that are diagnosing anemia or respiratory diseases using AI in really low resource settings. We have teams that are building natural language processing for polysynthetic indigenous languages while keeping the data sovereignty for that language and that cultural identity. Or we have blockchain-based parametric microinsurance for farmers. All of those are different products that hit on different impact goals. We are impact first, which is a delightful thing to be. And it's for us to think about how do we leverage MIT's brand, network, tech expertise to raise up the profile of these teams and provide an opportunity for capital to come into these impact spaces when we can show that they are provable lower risk.
Excellent. The next question I had in mind was, what is the role of Futurists in helping long-term investors and entrepreneurs? And I'm answering my own question quickly just to give you an example of how practical this can be. I did a research in 2010 on the future of space, a renaissance of space, 8 scenarios about where the space industry could go next. And one of my conclusions in around 2012 was an explosion of debris in space. And in 2015, 2016, I meet with a family office who says, well, actually, that's something we want to do. So from 2016 to 2024, that's how long it took, 8 years to raise the money, 3 rounds of financing, hire the engineers, block the time for the launches. We launched 4 satellites in February in New Zealand to create the world's first debris detection system that is space-based, not Earth-based. Before that, it was just with telescopes and radars, but now we have a much better system that is tracking in space what's happening. But that road for me as a futurist and foresight expert was still very long between the trend identification that could go macro to an enterprise, working with the entrepreneurs and the founders of the company. The road can be long. It's not like a ChatGPT was invented in 10 months. It was thought about more than a decade ago. So, Sacha, you were going to give some example where you can find as investors inspiration from the foresight work.
Yeah, I'm happy to share that. So, I mean, one of the fun things about being an investor is you get to cosplay as many different people in different parts of the month or year. But frequently we take stock and think about sectors that we've spent quite a bit of time in, and sort of what we project out the next 5 years will look like in those industries, right? And a big exercise, I think, when we do that, is sort of putting ourselves into the seat of a futurist, right? And thinking about what is going to be important, right? So a great example of this is in early 2020, And I hate to say before the pandemic was a thing. I think it's better to say before, some parts of the world took the pandemic seriously. We had done a fair bit of work on financial inclusion as sort of the layer one for the region in terms of an area of like innovation that we were seeing sort of rapid traction in, whether it was based on consumer desires, whether it was based on regulatory support, or whether it was based on sort of existing incumbents' desires to digitize. And at the beginning of 2020, when we sort of completed that work the year before, we started to think about the healthcare system. And this was before this was before, obviously, like I said, we had lockdown and the pandemic, etc. And the fundamental thing that we considered in that context was, if you think about the healthcare system, and I'm using this as an example, you have sort of three key stakeholders that are largely agreed upon, which are the payers, the providers, and the patients. And for those three stakeholders, across the very sort of basic nexus of preventative care, the first time you interact with a doctor, the second time you interact with a doctor, in more specifics, diagnostics, when you physically enter a hospital, and then finally like the treatment afterwards, and then all these enabling technologies across, such as fintech, insurtech, the way your data is controlled, like what do we see as like the big pain points, or what do we see as like the challenges of the next 5 years, right? And like where do we see opportunities for like incremental, but then also exponential change across that value chain. It just so happened that like a month and a half into that exercise, we were thrown into lockdown, and we kind of got a front row seat to what all of those problems were. And I think it kind of became a global topic in terms of, it was very clear where the weaknesses in the healthcare system were, but there was also the significant like impetus and focus on fixing it, right? And I think kind of now, for example, sort of in the wake of COVID, I think that we had a lot of initial thoughts around this is going to be important, and this is going to be great, and like telehealth is going to be great. But a key takeaway that we had from obviously like investing in telehealth was that telehealth is great for like diagnosing COVID, and great, there's a bit of more rapid uptake in terms of digitizations of healthcare facilities and hospitals. But really, in most situations when people are sick, doctors need a little bit more data than what you would usually request in a COVID diagnosis to be able to tell what's wrong with you, so eventually you come into the facility anyway, right? And so I think that a key point there was like we were thinking about what's the future of the sector, and then the learning was the real world sort of always has a role to play in how that sector plays out, right? Now we're currently doing the second iteration of our digital health thesis, and we're kind of thinking in a post-COVID world, what's going to happen in the next 5 years? And I think that this whole exercise had two really, really important takeaways for me, which was the first is there's definitely a role of the future or the futurists to participate in supporting investors or capital allocators to understand what would be the most impactful, or what are perhaps some of the most important areas or the least considered areas. I think that where there are challenges perhaps between how futurists and investors think about things is specifically around what I mentioned at the beginning, which is sort of path to commercialization. Like you can have a fantastic idea, and I'll come back to healthcare as an example, which is most of the drugs that we consume these days have been almost exclusively tested on Caucasian clinical trial patients. A few years ago, we started to look into personalized medicine and creating specific medicines for specific phenotypes and genotypes. And on the face of it, it sounds like a fantastic idea, right? You have a significant part of the global population having drugs used on them that aren't necessarily the safest or have the highest efficacy for their phenotype or genotype. And I think that's the kind of idea a futurist might say is like, that's fantastic. People should have access to democratized, personalized medication for themselves. We did a little bit of digging, and what we understood was that while this is like a fantastic idea in theory, in reality, basically no pharma companies cared about purchasing any data about other phenotypes and genotypes, perhaps except for China, which at the time had instated that for any drug to be sold within China, there had to be a clinical trial run on 20 to 30 Chinese patients. And that was like, for me, a great example of where there's a wonderful idea, but the commercial reality of that based on a fund life, we invest over a 10-year period, that just doesn't match. And so I think to one of the conversations we were having yesterday, which is how do you bridge that gap between the sort of short-term incentives and desires and requirements of an investor and the need to create ROI and the sort of longer-term big problems that do need to be addressed.
There was a book called Build to Last that you may have read by Jim Collins. And I remember Fast Company, the magazine, one year during the dot-com years, they put on Build to Flip instead of Build to Last. And the thesis was about that because they invest thinking not about the future of the company, they invest thinking about who they could sell the company next in 4 or 5 years. Yes?
Yeah, so let's just peel back on some of the things Sacha just mentioned. Since we're futurists, I think every investor by definition is a futurist, right? I've got $1 or a dinar, and I can invest it anywhere. Dubai, Accra, New York, wherever. Buenos Aires, okay? Where am I gonna get the biggest bang for a buck in the shortest amount of time, with the least amount of risk, and the least amount of follow-on capital? How do I optimize every incremental dollar? That's what we're solving for. So I'm looking to solve big problems, right? If I can solve a big problem, I can make a lot of money. But Sacha just said 2 or 3 things that were actually beautiful because this is why we have a problem. One, her fund is 10 years, which means she's gonna put her money to work for the first 5 years, and then it's over. So if she can't realize a gain in, call it 7 years, she's got a problem. So even as a great idea, she's not doing it. The second thing she said, Big Pharma is not interested in 40 or 50% of the world's population. They don't care that it's not optimized. Did you all hear that? They don't care that it's not optimized. Okay. So as an African, somebody who controls capital, who has lots of friends who control capital, we've actually looked at some of these issues. How might we actually decide to care? What if I don't have to worry about somebody in Pennsylvania deciding whether or not they're going to use drugs on people who look like me that have nothing to do with us necessarily? What if we decided we are going to create that, we're going to pay for it, and we're going to optimize those drugs to solve our health issues? What if? That's a possibility. There's somebody in this room who knows somebody who actually has a resource. We're not talking about crazy amounts of money. The same money that they give to an anonymous AI robot somewhere, we can't get for something in Africa that could solve problems today. Why? So the issue isn't data. It's what do you see with the data you get? What do you care about? When you look at the world, what do you see? That's value-driven. That's not data. Do you see opportunity? Do you see risk? What do you see? And that's what's so exciting to me about being in these rooms. We're in a room of people who are creative, who can see beyond what the average investor sees, or the average farmer sees, or the average policymaker sees. They can see more. That's why I come to places like this. I constantly want to see more and more and more and more. And that means I have to get and talk to people like you all. And I'm encouraging you to think every time you hear one of those comments, ask why. Who made it such that a pharmaceutical company could decide we're just gonna wing it for half the population? Okay, and the other thing I want to just mention is something that Alex said, which he talked about impact. There was, we haven't talked much about EdTech, but we were talking about it earlier. There's a Dr. Amel Karboul from Tunisia who runs something called the Education Outcomes Fund. I interviewed her about 3 or 4 years ago. We're talking about impact investing. She taught me something very important. She says Africans spend a lot of money on education. It's not they don't spend money, they over-index. The issue is the money they're spending, are we producing the student that can be employed or create a job for themselves? Yes or no? So the issue isn't impact. We buy books, they sit in a warehouse. That's impact. But did the book get in the mind of the student to generate learning, to generate job? No. So she doesn't focus on impact anymore. Lots of stuff is impactful. She cares only about outcome. Students properly trained, world competitive, ready to work, ready to create employment. That's a different way of thinking. So if we just tick boxes, and I had dinner the other night and it came up. Big foundation spent $500 million on healthcare, a great machine, and then they figured out that they don't have the humans to work the machine. $500 million spent in a machine that maybe one day will work when they get enough people to read it or use it. That's the kind of thinking that won't get us where we need to go. So in my view, these 10-year funds, these foundations, we love them. We love I'm one of them. I'm simply saying we must do better, and I'm prayerful in this company we'll be able to do that. Thank you.
Can I pick up on two pieces there? One, my monitoring and evaluation team would like to question your definition of impact there, because they would say that impact only happens if you can prove it at the end. It comes after outcomes. We'd say that the first one is outputs, and that books in a warehouse are an output, and kids that are well-educated and can produce the next generation of entrepreneurs, that's the outcome, that's the impact we want. We have a whole program on learning effectiveness in education to help put evidence into some of these nonprofits and other teams. I think the second piece is thinking about where we can put those investors in touch or in validation with some of these ideas, right? So I happen to be associated with a brand that some people find validating. And so when MIT puts a stamp on things, that opens doors for people. And so I think the most cogent example of that is we have a team, Kenyan innovator named Haider, who runs a company called Sanefa, smart greenhouses, AI and other pieces, increases yields, increases incomes. It's good. Not smallholders. We were talking about this, but it's aimed at this kind of middle-income farmer that you have a little bit of disposable income and you can reset a lot. He's got good traction. He's got some tens of thousands of users. He was sitting next to someone at our event because we selected him. We brought him to MIT. We put him in a room with investors, and he sat next to someone who then invested because he sat next to him. And they saw that. They saw that it's a de-risking because of the values that they bring, the values that they attribute to other places. And it's then a question of how do we use those of us with privilege in that network, how do we use that to put the spotlight to raise up people who we can show from a tech perspective, from a market perspective, from a traction perspective, from an impact perspective, have that value, and we'll build those futures, we'll build those different pieces. How do we put those in contact with the investors who are otherwise skeptical or otherwise have blinders on what they're able to see because they're in New York all the time and they're not necessarily running into innovators from Buenos Aires or Nairobi?
No, which kind of leads to the hype or purpose, because you could also use Futurists to hype your investment thesis or your companies, whereby you find good talking heads who are kind of saying great things about the future of your company or sector, versus having Futurists who are guiding investors on priority stuff that makes sense for the future and are a lot more rational. And I'd like to remind you that 10 years ago in 2014, the favorite investment topic of the VC world was gaming. Everybody was investing in gaming. Well, you know, and we had COVID and we were wondering why we didn't invest more in biotech, etc. So isn't there that kind of danger of going for hype versus purpose? Or
I think hype is such an interesting piece because often I find that hype is associated with a technology. And I think one of the most important learnings that we have is being driven by problems and not by technologies, right? So we're taking, and there's certainly a role for futurists in helping us understand which problems have the most leverage in different futures. But we have been through a few different hype curves with some blockchain pieces and some generative AI pieces, which there's a lot of potential with generative AI, but it also has some hypey bits right now. And for all of those, what we rely on is innovators who bring us a specific problem they're solving. There's a lot of innovators who are excited about our technology and they don't have a specific market in mind, they don't have a specific problem. But those who are really passionate about the problem and they're solving that, regardless of what technologies they need to pull in, whether it's brand new stuff or older stuff, that's the space that we see value, and it helps us, I think, cut through some of that hype. We certainly have good examples for every hyped technology, and then we have a lot of other pieces that we've discarded, but that's never the criteria that we're using to select. We're always thinking about, is there a good problem? Is there a real impact? Is the technology that you're using proven or provable and a reasonable fit for the problem you're trying to solve? I think alongside that, right, it sits with, are the people that you're picking to run that, do they have the grit? Do they have the resilience that we want in innovators? Are they also close to the problem? Do they have some connection to the people that are being served, particularly when there's human impact, when we're talking about education, when we're talking about health, when we're talking about economic prosperity, we're talking about the impacts of climate. You know, are they close to some of those spaces so that they understand why it's important, what things will or won't work when you're looking at lost water revenue in Niger, that, oh, well, turns out that when you put water meters in, some people will come along with baseball bats and whack them off, and you won't have meters unless you do something different to mitigate that factor. And people who understand those pieces are going to get you faster, they're going to be lower risk, they're going to be a better investor space. Also, if we can help them understand that for people who are trying to build ventures. So I think those are different pieces that hype is a product of focusing on getting excited about technologies to the exclusion of problems. And the more that we're focused on what specific problems are we trying to solve and technology as a tool, the less that I worry about hype as a result. I just get to follow it and see, oh, we have this piece and we don't have that piece.
I think it's tough to be a VC investor and pretend that we're siloed from hype. It's kind of synonymous with our name, and I guess it's important to underscore, especially for people who don't understand the venture model, the probability baked into our model is that 20% of the investments that you make will provide outsized impact, and therefore the rest can essentially fail. In US, I think it's 70% failure rate. And so you kind of assume that you will invest in technologies that might not pan out, but it's a risk-return game at its core, right? And I think a great example of this was, similar to what you shared about gaming, is in 2021, there was a lot of hype around Web3. And sort of Web3 was sort of the evolution of Web 2 as we understood it, moving into a space which is like, decentralized and democratized and sort of, blockchain, which you mentioned, sort of like the immutable source of truth. And funding in 2021 for blockchain was $34 billion. Funding in 2023, funding for Web3 was $34 billion in 2021. And last year in 2023, it was $9 billion, which is a very, very clear reflection of sort of hype around a technology or around sort of a set of technologies and sort of this new paradigm that we were going to be entering, and then the reality of that in the real world, which is kind of what I touched upon before. And I think that a key takeaway for me isn't that it's a question of hype versus purpose, because hype in many situations is helpful because it creates excitement, to your point, around a technology. It creates visibility. It creates sort of
it gets people to come after it and see where you can use this to do real things with it.
100%.
Yeah.
And AI is a great example of that, because we've seen now that through the democratization, access to ChatGPT, the average person understands what it is like to interact with generative AI, right? Which created hype. And sure, we saw inflation and valuation and many different things, but I think it's a net positive. And
there's really cool stuff that's coming out of it with the generative AI. People are using it in all sorts of different, unexpected ways because it's more accessible.
Exactly, and but it's a hyped sector.
Yep.
Now, Web3, I think, is a great example, because I don't think it was a challenge of it was hyped versus its purpose. From a purpose perspective, it sounds great. You have decentralized finance. You have blockchain, where you kind of have this like immutable truth. You have crypto, which is kind of like this sort of ability to access assets which are like, not sovereign. I think that the challenge was more the mechanics of the rails of the technology into the real world, which is a friction that I see frequently between the ideas of futurists and the realities of the world we live in, right? And that is, how does an FTX happen when there's no regulation, right? How are there fundamental challenges and flaws in the security of blockchain which actually make it fundamentally not useful, right? When you think about DAOs, it's wonderful to have decentralized ownership, but then the rails into the real world still need you to rely on the legal structures that are already existing, right? And I think that it's kind of like, in theory, all these things are absolutely wonderful and they would serve a wonderful purpose, but in reality, like, do they really pan out that way? And so I guess like where futurists, I think, and investors maybe need to collaborate a little bit more, it comes back to the point on sort of commercialization, but then also like the viability with the constrictions of sort of the real world, and sort of bridging that gap is something that really, really stands out to me.
Can I just one quick one on this?
Quickly.
Again, we're getting to the point of what matters.
Yeah.
What really matters? Just a question. What matters to you? What's the world you want to see, right? There are all kinds of futures. What's the one we choose? And what I'm trying to get to, and I used to invest in all kinds of cool stuff with lots of kind of cool people, then I got rid of all that. I got to the essential. In most of our countries, you could do a stellar job and still lose money after foreign exchange messes you up, right? So you need an enabling environment, which means of the 54 countries, which one are the top 3 or 4 or 5 where the government's even remotely serious? This is anywhere in the world. I'm just talking about Africa because I deal in Africa. So where are people serious? Serious leaders, serious thinkers, serious entrepreneurs. People who are willing to sleep on the floor. They're not going to get $10 million. They're going to get whatever. We're going to keep iterating. If you can't make money with $100,000 in Africa to start, there's a problem, in my mind. What's wrong? The average human makes $1 there, $1 a day. You can't figure out how to make a business with 500,000, $1 million. You don't know how to do that? That doesn't, 10 million won't solve your problem. So for me, it's really kind of, how are we going to solve big issues? Money movement without friction, transportation, big issue, food security, big issue, climate change, big issue. I was speaking to somebody at dinner the other day, and he was telling me about ag tech. And I said, okay, the average cocoa farmer in Ghana, how old do you think they are? He said, I don't know, 15. I said, 55. Do you think they're really going to use AI to do anything that they, no. They can't even afford to buy the chocolate that's made from the cocoa that they're growing, been growing for generations. We're playing at levels that don't make sense to me, but I have very limited thinking. I'm happy, that's why I'm here, to be exposed and have my thinking expanded. How do we solve that problem? Poverty at scale, doubling in 23 years, willing to get on across the desert, get on a boat and go to Italy, which is why we're seeing some of the dynamics politically we're seeing around the world. How are we going to use our capital and our thinking and our AI tools, gaming, whatever, to address these challenges that we see? They're not going anywhere. They're going to get bigger. What are the dreams of the average 8-year-old in Ghana or Somalia or Kenya or wherever, Mexico? What are their dreams? What are they thinking about? So we saw some of that this morning. And I think I want us to, in some ways, use the wisdom, the brilliance we have to actually start afresh. What if the goal was to actually address and maximize 1 billion more young people, all that energy, minds to be shaped and grown? What could we do with that? What's the possibility? Just as a game. Talk about gaming theory. What if? What if we decided to use that, all that power? What might we create? That's where I'm really going, because otherwise I don't see it. As an investor now, I focus on licenses. I focus on anything that has foreign exchange opportunities, because I can't trust the local economies, because I can't trust the local leaders enough. I can trust them to do what they generally do, and therefore I have to protect my investment. But I'm looking at something so much bigger, because I see the opportunity as if we could crack that. And there are thinkers in this room, in this environment, who actually have the ability to do it. So I'm just seeding this. This is a prayer, okay? I'm seeding. Thank you.
Picking up on your what if, let's say we are meeting again here in 2044, and 20 years from now, and what if we feel that capitalism has been transformed for the greater good, and maybe because long-term investors are more future-minded, driven by outcomes, and have greater impact. So what will have changed in 20 years from now for having that transformed capitalism?
I'm happy to take this one first, because it's basically everything that Judith said, which is, I think that fundamentally the source of capital has to change. So to the point you made around why doesn't sort of African or Asian healthcare data matter to pharma companies, it's because specifically in the African context, and we looked at many, many businesses in this space, there's not enough purchasing power on the continent for drugs for it to be a market of significance right now, right? And I think that kind of says that from most of the pharma companies, which also happen to come from, developed markets, they get to choose what matters and what doesn't matter, because they're the source of capital. So I think that in the future, what we would see from a source of capital perspective would be perhaps more of a decentralization. So more democratization around who participates in the funding process around futuristic ideas and the future. I would say, you've heard the saying, which is like history is written by the victors. I think the future is written by the people who have money, right? So to a certain extent, it's the redistribution of wealth would have to be significant, and the decision makers who allocate capital would have to see more diversity. And then the second point around sort of the source of capital for me, or sort of what would sort of be a utopia, I guess, in some sense, is more patient capital, more evergreen fund structures. So this sort of inherent mismatch, which is the point that I think I've discussed throughout this panel, is between the short-term requirements of investors and capital and the structures that exist today, and the longer-term sort of patience that's required for some of these more futuristic ideas to become a reality. So I'd say sort of more patient evergreen capital and distributed capital as well would be sort of two things.
Alex?
Yeah, it's yes to all of these different pieces. And I think what often intrigues me is how we get there, right? It's the steps on, I don't think power gives itself up willingly. I don't think capital is going to give itself up willingly. So we have to find ways that capital accumulates in other spaces so that power accumulates. I think what I find, I come from the climate space originally. I talk about all these different areas, but I come from the climate space. And right now there's a lot of discussion in the climate space around both carbon and biodiversity credits in different ways with a lot of problems in those markets. But one of the pieces that people are trying to work towards is so that communities get clear, significant value out of that trade. So the nature that they are protecting, whether they're indigenous communities or others, farmers, that they see that value. And so thinking about how that value comes back to communities as a result of new innovations that are sourced from different places, that are built for the cocoa farmers in Cote d'Ivoire, that are able to see benefits from those different pieces and have that capital accumulate so that who gets to allocate capital, maybe not enormous amounts of capital, but as we say, it doesn't take an enormous amount of capital to get a lot of these pieces started, can change and so that you get more market power over time. That also relies on two pieces. One is, having philanthropy right now that is well-intentioned and wants to guide towards some of these strategic pieces. I think we're seeing that. We get to work with a lot of philanthropists who are interested in doing good, big work. That means we have the honor of being able to help guide some of where that should go. The second is founders who are aware of some of these systemic pieces and don't necessarily want their ideas to get swallowed up and squashed. We've worked with some founders in the circular economy space who, one of them is like, look, I have this great space for really circular plastic coming out of recycling waste bags, chemical recycling, good space. And her thing from day one is, I do not want to go, my normal exit for that sort of piece would get acquired by a big chemical company, Dow, DuPont, whichever. And she's like, I do not want that because that's going to squash all these different pieces. It's going to be a much harder road. I'm going to figure out how to make this work in other ways. But I don't want that because I want to accumulate that so I have another path forward. And we're going to need some people who are going to take that harder road in different ways. If we have more people invested in this space, we're going to have more opportunities for that kind of benevolence. I think the final space, coming back to this idea of we need other kinds of capital, yes, we need, what I'll say is like strategic innovation, which comes from two ways. One is having people who can think about the messy, complicated systems that are cities, that where you have some innovations, and you have some policies, and you have some behaviors, and all of them need to be thought about from a futuring perspective and an innovations perspective together, and you need capital that can sit in all those different areas to move those forward. Hello. But looking at those different pieces, that gives us an opportunity to push capitalism in different ways, but I think it does come back to that decentralization in different ways.
I think just one thing to add in the entrepreneurship ecosystem, which is important, is that I don't know if she wants to add something to the conversation. I'm just kidding. But it's that actually, like, by allocating capital as investors to these economies, you create sort of a network effect in terms of sort of the next generation of wealth within those markets. So in the US, for example, you have the PayPal mafia. In the UAE, one of our most famous exit stories is Careem, which was acquired by Uber, and it's the Careem cartel, right? And those founders then become sort of, you've minted the next generation of people who are sort of spreading technology, but also spreading wealth, and it comes back to the decentralization of sources of capital in the future, and how we bring them back here is like by funding innovation here and creating that same network effect we've seen in other markets.
With the risk, right, that's this like key leverage piece then of when we create those folks, how are they steeped in futurism? How are we helping them to guide to make better decisions versus some of the tech billionaires in the US right now who are kind of famously made some bad decisions around like pro-social decisions. And I think that's.
But this is the thing. I think, so I hear you and I agree with you, all of you. So my thing is, for each of us, let's figure out where in the curve we have our superpowers, right? So what am I really good at? Is it the beginning, the middle, or the end? That's a question. This issue of network effects, very, very important. And maybe we don't think about geography. I've been thinking, since I've come to this conference, about maybe the African city isn't even in Africa. Yesterday, was it Dr. Khanna was talking about the maps, I think was Dr. Khanna, is his name?
Yes.
Yes. And I was thinking, maybe we shouldn't even be thinking about an African city physically in Africa. Maybe we should be thinking about networked Africans all over the world so that geography becomes irrelevant in a networked world. So I'm not tied so maybe I can invest in businesses, or Africans should be investing in businesses in different countries. And so if there's a bias against African or Middle Eastern or Latin American entrepreneurs, maybe those entrepreneurs or investors should be citing ourselves in places where we don't have that bias, or teaming up with people who can actually help us. But we maybe need to think more creatively about that. So anyway, I just wanted to put that on the table.
Thank you.
Expand our thinking beyond geography.
And Sacha mentioned a source of capital. We could think about destination of capital. For the last 3 years, what is the country in the world that has attracted the most FDI? It's the United States of America. And post-Trump election, there is even more money from around the world going to the US, which is a very different environment than what we had before with the rise of China, the BRICS, etc. It would be interesting if you could raise a question, if we have a microphone that is, go ahead, yes, here.
Hey there, I'm Johan Mattsson from Futures Platform. So every now and then when I go to events, and I sometimes meet VCs, but not for seeking funding, just I see them there and go to talk. And then I start talking about like strategic foresight and future studies and so forth. Usually the answer is like, foresight, what? Futurist, who? So and I've already gotten like 2 answers from you. The other one is that every investor thinks they are the futurist. That might be the reason. The other one is the investment horizon you mentioned. So it's just too far out. I'm thinking, couldn't it also be just the basic logic of how investment and capitalism works? You just put out like, let's say 100 investments and let the market decide what's the future. We don't need to mind about it.
Well, the goal, so first of all, let's think about the business of investing, right? Sacha and others, I used to be a financial entrepreneur. So my job is to raise multiple funds as a financial entrepreneur. So I can't just let the market decide. I have to be thoughtful, because if my returns aren't good enough, I won't get any more money. And so what you see with a lot of these big institutions, check their IRRs, the rates of return on investment. Pretty low, actually, to be honest. They got $20 billion, $50 billion under management, but how much money are they making? Not that much. It's not easy to put $50 billion to work, by the way, but they're not as smart as we think they are, but they get 2% plus 20% above whatever the whatever the preferred return is. So the business of funds isn't necessarily to make big bets. It's not to lose too much capital so they can do what? The second fund after year 3, 4, 5. So it's like manufacturing money or investment capital. It's not necessarily solving big risk. So it's kind of an interesting thing. That's one. The second thing is, I found a lot of people, and I've done this myself, I used to think when I first got to Wall Street that these guys were willing to take risk. They're the most risk-averse people I've ever met in my life. It's frightening. I was like, wow, okay, I thought you guys like risk. They don't want any risk. So they're focusing on those entrepreneurs, which is why you see one guy can do 5 companies. They want to bet on the human that they feel comfortable with. They don't feel comfortable with you, you'll never get money, which is why a lot of us never get any money. They'd rather give it to a machine than give it as a PhD. You know the best educated immigrant group in America? Talk about American investment. Anybody want to venture a guess? Nigerian Americans. Google it. Nigerians. The most educated immigrants in America. Best educated. Okay, how many of them get money? Why don't we know that? This is American statistics. Please Google it. Anybody in the room, please Google if I'm lying. Okay, so there's something in this perception, which is why many of us care about the perceptions of AI, because if these misperceptions continue, we're going to have this misalignment of money and I guess assessments of what our value is. I don't see the young African, and we see this with music, dance crazes, fashion. There's a guy with a cell phone making beats in Lagos, and people are dancing to it in Abu Dhabi or Accra, wherever, all over the world, Latin America. How come that's possible? Creativity knows no bounds and people like it, but that kid needs a chance. And now technology allows them to make a beat. I need my creativity and electricity. I don't need that much electricity. I can make something from almost nothing. There's all these scams that we see, love scams, where are they coming from? There's some creativity. I don't like that creativity, but we have to admit, how come they're so creative? Because all I need is a cell phone and a dream, right? And I can create a character. I can tell a story. People can believe me. Anyway, I just wanted to put that out there.
Was another question?
Just to add to that question and to the responses, I just want to say a few things, which is one, if you ever meet an investor who thinks they're the smartest person in the room, they're a liar, because that's never the case. And I think that it's very important to recognize that especially when you're a generalist, you see a lot of breadth, you don't necessarily see tons of depth, and we rely on founders or entrepreneurs to be the sector specialists in whatever it is we're investing in, right? I think the second part is the extent to which you are investing across a portfolio of risk, sort of with your eyes covered, and to which you have more data around the companies, is a function of the stage you invest at, right? And now, with the first thing being true around, we look at a lot of breadth, and it's difficult for us to be very deep in many situations. If you're a pre-seed or a seed investor, fundamentally, you don't understand whether or not a technology is going to pan out a certain way, right? We invest at Series A, which means that we have initial traction and proof of concept, which means we're allowed to take slightly more calculated risk. Now, the trade-off there is obviously the pricing when you come into a transaction. So I think that's kind of fundamentally why we'd love for it to be, but I think it's a function of a few different things. The third thing, which you touched upon, is the time value of money. Unfortunately, is a big concept in the investing world, right? Which is money today is worth something different tomorrow. And I think that's such a core fundamental belief that underpins all financial systems as we know it today. I think something extremely radical would have to happen for that to change. And the fourth, which I'll share, is the unique perspective, I think, of the region, is we are a drop in the ocean. The Middle East and Africa is a drop in the ocean when it comes to global venture funding, which means that we have a higher impetus than other places in the world to make sure that we are able to raise more money again in the future. Which means, to a certain extent, I think the first layer of investment that we'll see within these markets is going to have to be validating that you can make returns, because the time value of money isn't going to change in the short term, and the sources of capital are not going to change in the short term as well. But the nice thing to think about in this part of the world as well is that by virtue of the places we invest in, by the young population, by virtue of the problems that we are seeing solved across these markets, impact is a wonderful side effect in almost every situation of every investment we make.
Everything that we see on those, the impact is woven in better ways, and $1 or a dirham can go a lot further in a lot of these cases, right? If I have $100,000 of prize funding and I can put it towards a team that's in Bangladesh, it goes really, really far away. We can build whole workshops in Myanmar to build houses and other pieces off of that versus $2 or $5 million for a climate prefab startup in the US.
Yes.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Parikshit. Thank you for your insights. I'd like to bring out a grassroots level challenge that's towards the small and medium scale industries. These guys want to scale, but they work around the taxes because the taxation's too high. It's squeezing their profits, and the payment cycle's horrible from the large corporates, but they do want to scale. The investors are not ready to believe in them. They do have the vision, they do have the passion, but why aren't investors seeing in that direction? Because their failure rate is way less compared to a startup. So you're ready to bet $1 billion on startups and on someone who's actually supporting the whole economy, employment, and the other ripple effects. So this is a roadblock I've been facing for quite a long time. So any insights on how or what kind of investors we need to approach to make the magic happen?
In my humble opinion, it's people in the local economy. Start, and then we can add. So somebody who has a vested interest in seeing employment and businesses grow. A friend of mine who just died, a gentleman by the name of Herman Chinnery Hesse, was sort of considered the Bill Gates of Africa. He died about a month or two ago. He said, if the average African just made $1,000, a month, $500 a month, we would be a lot better off. And then this is a small and medium. Elon Musk doesn't help us. I respect his intellect and his drive, but he does nothing. He's an African by birth, but it means nothing. He could have $2 trillion. How will it impact the company you're trying to help? So we have to find people who actually have a vision. This is a room of visionaries and their friends and those who love you, right? How do we actually impact the life of somebody who can create employment so we actually have peace and security and livelihoods in our regions? That's the question. And I think it starts at home, and then we have these dialogues. And we try to say, okay, I put $1 million, will you add to mine? I would love everybody here, even if you don't have to, I won't vet this, but if you would be willing to give 1% of your savings to a small, medium enterprise, to a young entrepreneur, a student needs help, understanding you may or may not get anything back. I do require that the students that I help make a pledge to help somebody else. I don't want it to end with you. I'm looking for that student who could help 100. Could we make a pledge? Just start to think, this is just an experiment, thought experiment. How would we start to see these environments? An entrepreneur that needs $10,000 with $5,000, $1,000 would change their lives. We don't need any huge things, but a venture capital fund will never do that. We need new forms of capital. It starts locally, and then we talk to our friends and see if they can help us build something that will mean something on the ground. Thank you.
I'll add to that by please come to apply to our challenges in February. Because I have capital that might be able to help with that and a validation stamp that might be able to help with that. So,
In closing, you probably noticed that I'm the only Canadian in the room. I have a BlackBerry. But there are two things. I come from the province of Quebec, and the government of Quebec decided in the 1970s, 1974, to make our public pension system an impact investor in terms of our province economy. So they need to protect the capital of future retirees, make an income, but they are also evaluated on the total economic impact on the productivity, the wealth of the citizens of Quebec, and the companies of Quebec have profited from that. And the company I'm working for today went from $0 to $10 billion, from 10 employees to 90,000 employees. And it's, yes, the founder is a great entrepreneur, but his best financial partner was our National Pension Plan Board. A year ago, I was with Noubar Afeshan, the founder of Moderna, and during the lunch, what did he say? He said, you know, it's a good thing I was financed notably by the Canadian Pension Investment Board because they were with me for 10 years and we would have never made it without an institutional investor who believed in me. So there is hope because there are also out there our money that we put towards our retirement that is managed by people who have that kind of vision. I invite you to look at FCLT. It's financing capital for the long term. They're based in Boston. They give guidelines and rules to large companies about investing in the long term, and they have proven results in terms of companies that outperform are not the ones that are with quarterly results. They are the ones who showcase great R&D investment and innovation over time and over time. We are over time. Thank you, Judith. Thank you, Sacha. Thank you, Alex. Thank you all for staying. It was, I think, the last workshop for the day, so thanks for your patience and being with us.